let's take a look at the Miami Dolphins and see what did they do during the 2018 offseason. Remember, this includes both free agency and the draft. But before we do, let's take a look at the Dolphins' cap situation. In mid-February, they only had $7 million of cap space. So they were in not a great situation to begin the offseason. As of August 2018, they had $14 million in cap space. So they actually have more money in cap space at the end of this offseason, more or less, than they did at the beginning. So how did that happen? Well, obviously they let some guys go. Who did they decide to let go? Well, first, let's look at some of the guys that I thought at the beginning of the offseason that they might let go. One guy was Julius Thomas. And in fact, I was right. They did let Julius Thomas go. It wasn't a big, surprise when you look at his numbers. When he was with Denver, he had 12 touchdowns in both 2013 and 2014, 788 yards in 2013. Jacksonville signed him in 2015. His numbers start dropping, 455 yards, 5 touchdowns. And then 281 yards because he missed, 7 games there in 2016. Miami brings him in. And the numbers improve only marginally. And so it's really not a surprise. When they were able to save $4.5 million, I'm surprised they gave him such a big deal to begin with. They gave him $5.6 million in 2017, even though he hadn't really had a very good season in more than 2 years. And they gave him $2 million guaranteed in 2018. So, when they cut him, they still have to pay him $2 million. They saved $4.5 million by getting rid of him, but still had to pay him $2 million because they guaranteed $2 million in 2018. So that is a really questionable decision by the Dolphins to bring in Julius Thomas, at those figures. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. Lawrence Timmons was another guy that I thought they might let go, and in fact, they did. I don't think it's a big surprise either, given the fact that at the start of the season last year, he went AWOL, and they didn't even know where he was. Their rumors were that he had gone back to Pittsburgh. So, not surprisingly, they decided to kick him to the curb. You can see that in his early years, for 7 years, he had averaged 100 tackles. But then last year, he dropped down to 84, which is not terrible. All right, 84 is not bad, but it's not 114. He didn't have any sacks, wasn't getting any pressure on the quarterback like he did before in his younger days. Did have 5 tackles for a loss, but, when you're able to save $5.4 million and get rid of a guy who, just went missing, not a difficult decision, really. Here we have Stephon Anthony. You can see here, he's still on his rookie contract, actually. So I'm not shocked, I guess, that they didn't get rid of him yet. Plus, he had a huge rookie year, 112 tackles, 6 tackles for a loss, but since then, it's been a train wreck. 16 tackles in 10 games in 2016 with the Saints. Miami gets him, and he's got 14 tackles in 8 games. He is on the bubble because he's set to be paid over $1 million this year. So it'll be an interesting, case to look at and see what the Dolphins decide to do with him. But They haven't cut him yet, but I'm not sure if they'll make the final roster or not. Let's look at the offensive unrestricted free agents the Dolphins had this offseason. These are the guys that could have signed with any team. All right. We got Jarvis Landry. That is the biggest name by far. And he killed it, man. I mean, look at his rookie contract. 4 seasons, never missed a game, averaged 100 catches per season. All right, so you'd see, exactly 100 catches per season, averaged 1,000, plus yards, 1,100 yards per season the last 3 years, 9 touchdowns last season. Big deal. Big contract. In terms of, value. I mean, this is the big player. This is a guy who tore it up for the Dolphins. But unfortunately, the Dolphins just didn't have a lot of money to keep him around. And he was a second-round pick. He's one of the best slot receivers in the NFL. And the Dolphins franchised him, but everyone knew they couldn't really afford to keep him. They don't have much cap space, and so they traded him. And they were able to get a 4th-round pick for him from the Browns, and the Browns ended up signing him to a huge deal. It was like 5 years, $75 million. So, the Dolphins would have needed $15 million a year just to keep him. It just wasn't really tenable. But that's a big loss. It's a huge loss. And we'll talk about how the Dolphins are going to try to replace him a little bit later. Damian Williams is another guy on the offense that was an unrestricted free agent. His numbers were not nearly as impressive. He was a backup. He wasn't the starter. He was playing behind Ajayi for a while. And he's second, third string running back. But you can see there he never got 4 yards a carry. His last season was his best season. It should say, I wrote 2017 twice. It should say 2016. But in 2017, he had 181 yards in 11 games, 3.9 yards a carry. It's not terrible, but, it's not irreplaceable either. He was playing on a restricted free agent tender last year worth $1.8 million, but he ended up signing with the the Chiefs for 1 year and $1.5 million. I'm not 100% sure he'll make the team in Kansas City. They've got a pretty crowded backfield there, but he won't be back in Miami next season. They've already got a couple of new guys, and we'll talk about that. Jermon Bushrod was another free agent. Offensive guard, started last year, but really struggled. 33 years old. He's at the tail end of his career. And he played on a 1-year, $3 million deal last year, but played so poorly that he's pretty much done as a starter in the NFL. He was able to get a 1-year, $1.1 million deal with New Orleans to be, their third or fourth string guard there. So he'll be competing for a spot on the roster, but won't be back in Miami. But not a huge loss for the Dolphins. And we'll talk about how did the Dolphins replace him. Defensive unrestricted free agents. William Hayes was a free agent this year. He'll be 33 this upcoming season, so he is also not a spring chicken. He's towards the tail end of his career as well. I don't know about this. Is another big head scratcher for me. All right, so he had some really good years with the Rams. Okay, 40 plus tackles, 4 or 5 sacks a year, several tackles for a loss, 7-8 tackles for a loss. So very strong numbers there for William Hayes. Last year came to Miami and in 10 games had 19 tackles and 1 sack. 3 tackles for a loss, and the Dolphins decide to sign him to another 1-year deal, this one worth $4 million, guaranteed. I don't know. I guess they have some reason to believe that last year was an aberration and that for some reason he's going to, bounce back at 33 years old. Maybe he will. This is one to watch. How does William Hayes do this season? Because I'm not quite sure why they gave him $4 million guaranteed after last year. But, what do I know? But, we'll see how that plans out. Terrence Fede is another free agent. He was kind of a reserve player on the defensive line, mainly a special teams player. Finished his rookie contract, was a 7th round pick, but he signed a 1-year deal with Buffalo for $790,000, so he won't be back with Miami. Not a huge loss, but that's another free agent that did play a little bit last year. Another few free agents, these guys were secondary players. Alteron Werner was a cornerback, 29 years old, was playing on a 1-year, $980,000 deal, but he remains unsigned. They decided not to bring him back so far. Michael Thomas was really more of a special teams player and a reserve safety. He received a 1-year tender last year worth $1.8 million, but he signed a 2-year, $4 million deal with the Giants, so he won't be coming back. And then there's Walt Aikens, who is also a kind of a special teams guy who is a reserve safety. He finished the final year of his rookie contract. He was a 4th round pick, and the Dolphins decided to bring him back for 2 years and $2.7 million. So they got to bring him back for a little bit cheaper than they would have Michael Thomas. But these are guys who mainly contribute on special teams, and special teams is important, but they're not guys who played a lot of defensive snaps. They're not starting safeties, but they were free agents, and they did contribute last year. Finally, Nate Allen, one more safety, 30 years old. He missed the last 9 games with a calf injury. He was versatile, could play either free safety or strong safety. Received $3.4 million last year, but Dolphins decided to let him walk so far and not bring him back. So let's summarize the changes on the Dolphins roster. Okay, what are the major changes on the roster for 2018 from what they had in 2017? Well, maybe the biggest change is that Ryan Tannehill is going to be back at quarterback, and Jay Cutler is going to go back into retirement where he belongs. I don't know who in the world thought that bringing in Jay Cutler was a good idea. I knew it was going to be a disaster from the beginning. I know that the owner there in Miami seems to be one of these stand for the pledge of, or the national anthem people. But I personally would have brought in Colin Kaepernick. And I know that's a controversial thing to say on the podcast or the video, but, my God, Jay Cutler, really? He had 2,666 yards, 19 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, 64% completion percentage. It's not horrible, but, I don't know about that. That's definitely not the direction I would have gone in when Tannehill went down. But that's the direction the Dolphins went in, so, that's what happens. Jay Cutler's out. Brock Osweiler is in as Tannehill's backup, and Bryce Petty as well. I guess those two guys will battle it out, for a spot on the roster there to back up Ryan Tannehill. Let's look at Ryan Tannehill's numbers real quick. You can see there in 2014 and 2015, 4,000 yards each year. Really, he averaged 4,000 yards for the first 3 years. Not a bad touchdown to interception ratio, 2-1. Over 60% completion percentage. Ryan Tannehill is a decent quarterback. You can see in 2016 he missed a few games and ended up falling just short of 3,000 yards, 19 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. I don't know. This is going to be a very important year for Ryan Tannehill and for the Dolphins, for them to figure out if this guy is the future, at quarterback, or if they're going to have to rebuild. It'll be interesting to see. How does Tannehill bounce back from his injury? At running back, Damian Williams is out. He was, a young guy, but like I said, never averaged 4 yards a carry, never had 200 yards rushing per season. He was a backup, and not a particularly great one. They brought in Frank Gore, the hometown kid, although he's not really a kid anymore, but Frank Gore, out of the U. And he'll be back in Miami to end out his career. I think it's a great story. Over the past 12 seasons, he averaged over 1,000 yards per season. 961 yards rushing last year. 34 years old, rushed for 961 yards, plus had 245 yards receiving. He has fallen below 4 yards a carry, so that's something that is unfortunate, I guess you could say. I mean, he's getting older, but his offensive line wasn't that great in Indianapolis, and he was getting a ton of carries. So, who knows? Maybe playing in Miami, maybe he'll have a bounce back year. I mean, I think he's a good running back still, and I think he's going to make the Hall of Fame, which is a really interesting discussion. Some people don't think so, but I think you'll see Frank Gore in the Hall of Fame. He's going to end up, maybe in the top 4 all time in career rushing yards, plus has quite a few receiving yards to go along with it. I'm a big Frank Gore fan. And they got him for 1 year at $1.1 million. It's a great value for a guy that's going to be like second or third string. They also drafted Kalen Ballage in the 4th round. Looks good. Heard a lot of good things. Apparently he looks quite good. He loves learning from Frank Gore. That's a guy to keep an eye on too. So running back, I think the Dolphins have definitely upgraded. At wide receiver, Jarvis Landry is gone. As I mentioned, he was traded to the Browns, who ended up giving him $75 million with $47 million guaranteed. Huge contract. They're going to try to replace him with Danny Amendola and Albert Wilson. Jarvis Landry's contract averages $15 million a year. They're giving $6 million a year to Amendola and another $8 million a year to Albert Wilson. It's almost the same amount, but you get, I guess, 2 guys instead of 1, but 2 guys who aren't as good as the 1 guy. So, we'll take a look at these guys' numbers. I don't think it's a horrible job at replacing Jarvis Landry. I don't, but I do think it's not an upgrade, and it's probably a step back a little bit, but there's Jarvis Landry's numbers, okay? Once again, 9 touchdowns last year, almost 1,000 yards receiving, had 1,100 yards the 2 years before that. One of the best slot receivers in the game. He creates mismatches. Amendola has had 600 yards 4 times in the last 6 seasons. He was a killer in the playoffs. But, he's 32 years old, I think. 32, 33 years old. We'll see. We'll see what he can do next year with the Dolphins. I think he'll be a good player. He certainly won't be able to single-handedly replace Jarvis Landry, though. But hopefully he'll stay healthy and provide some good yards there for the Dolphins. Albert Wilson had 554 yards. So you put them together. Okay, now the touchdowns is way less. Jarvis Landry had 9 touchdowns last season. Together, Albert Wilson and Danny Amendola only had 5, but yardage-wise, they passed Landry. But Albert Wilson, he's trending upwards. Okay, he had the best year of his career to finish out his rookie contract, 554 yards. I think the Dolphins will be okay at receiver. I think they'll be okay. It's hard to say they upgraded, but it's hard to say they took a big step back either. If anything, it'll be a small, tiny step backwards. Overall, I think the Dolphins will be okay there at receiver. At tight end, Julius Thomas and Anthony Fasano are both gone. Fasano was 34 years old, only had 107 yards receiving. They used their second-round pick to bring in Mike Gesicki from Penn State. That's a big deal. He was the best tight end in college football last season. A potential star. So then they also brought in Durham Smythe in the 4th round out of Notre Dame. And they also signed Gavin Escobar, who didn't play last year and only had 30 yards in 2016, so I don't think he's going to be the big difference maker. But I think it's an upgrade. Definitely the Dolphins upgraded at tight end. So they'll have at quarterback they'll have Tannehill back. At running back they upgraded. At tight end they upgraded. Overall, I think the offense looks good. And then don't forget at guard, Jermon Bushrod is gone, and he was terrible, or at least not very good. Anthony Steen, is a backup player. He also will be out, but Josh Sitton is coming in. And if Josh Sitton can stay healthy, that's a big upgrade for the Dolphins offensive line. A big upgrade over Bushrod. So good news there on the offensive line. Now, on this case, though, at center, I don't know. Mike Pouncey wanted out. So he's gone. Daniel Kilgore is in. I think that's a step back on the offensive line. So, by the time you factor in Sitton in, but Pouncey out, it's not a big upgrade overall. Let's look at defensive end. Terrence Fede, I mentioned, is out. He was mainly a reserve player on defense. But in comes Robert Quinn. That could be a really nice signing. That could be a good signing. Here's a guy who had double-digit sacks, from 2012 to 2014. Look at that year in 2013. 19 sacks. 12 tackles for a loss. 7 forced fumbles. What a year. But that was a long time ago in NFL years. And, he missed half the games in 2015, basically half the games in 2016. But he had a good year last year under Wade Phillips there in 2017. 15 games, 32 tackles, 8.5 sacks. It's not a bad year for a guy at his age. You can see the variety of injuries he had in 2015 and 2016. So, if he can stay healthy at his age, I think Robert Quinn will definitely bring some pass rush, and he'll definitely improve the defensive line there in Miami. But on the downside at defensive tackle, the Dolphins cut Ndamukong Suh. That's a huge loss. It's a huge loss. You look at his numbers in Detroit, he was generating a lot of pass rush, 10 sacks as a rookie, 8.5 sacks in that 5th year. And then, with Miami, he still had a couple of big years, those first 2 years. 61 tackles, 6 sacks, 11 tackles for a loss, 72 tackles, 5 sacks, 8 tackles for a loss. But last year, only 47 tackles in 16 games. I guess the Dolphins decided to, cut too early rather than too late. You know what I mean? And I think they really just needed the space as much as anything. So that's a pretty big loss. It's a huge loss. And they're going to try to replace him with Akeem Spence, who played with Detroit last year. I mean, had a good year. had a good year in Detroit, matched his best year of his career with 39 tackles, 3 sacks, and 4 tackles for a loss, but I don't know. That's a big drop-off. That's a big drop-off. To lose Sue, who creates mismatches, it'll be tough. It'll be tough to replace him. Linebacker, Lawrence Timmons, starting strong side linebacker, gone. Ray Malaluga, backup linebacker, gone. Neville Hewitt, reserve linebacker, gone. How are they going to replace these guys? Well, they drafted Jerome Baker in the 3rd round. He'll be competing for that, strong side linebacker spot that was vacated by Lawrence Timmons. They brought in Terrence Garvin, who is a reserve player, career backup, 25 tackles last year. And then they drafted Quentin Poling in the 7th round. But the real big news at linebacker is Raekwon McMillan is back. They drafted him in the 2nd round last year, but ended up tearing his ACL in the first preseason game. This is the guy that they think is going to be their future middle linebacker. Really, he can play all 3 positions, but he's expected to play in the middle, and that's huge. To get Raekwon McMillan back, that's a big upgrade for the Dolphins defense, and we'll see who wins that strong side linebacker spot. At cornerback, Alteron Werner is out, but he was just a backup. And Cornell Armstrong is in, 6th round pick. And finally, at safety, Nate Allen is gone. He was a backup safety. Michael Thomas is gone. He was just a reserve player. But they drafted Minkah Fitzpatrick in the 1st round. He can play either free safety or maybe be the slot corner. The Dolphins have a couple of really good safeties that are going to be returning. So, it's not for sure that Minkah Fitzpatrick will play safety this year. But you have to assume at some point he'll be, the starting safety there. And the real interesting story with Minkah Fitzpatrick is that somehow word got out that the Dolphins owner specifically did not want him. That the Dolphins owner wanted to trade back in order to get some extra picks. But if they didn't trade back, he specifically didn't want Minkah Fitzpatrick. How awkward is that? To know that your owner did not want you. Not just like, he wanted somebody else. No, he didn't want you. So, I don't know. We'll see how he responds to that. I think it'll give him some extra fuel for the fire, but that's awkward. I'll just say that. And the Dolphins also brought in Trey Elston for depth. So, overall, I'd say the Dolphins defense, about the same, a little bit better at defensive end maybe. Step back at defensive tackle. Maybe a slight step up at linebacker, at corner, not a big change there. And then at safety, an upgrade, I guess, there at safety. So Dolphins should expect to have a better offense in 2018, a similar defense to 2018. Is that going to be enough to get them in the playoffs with Ryan Tannehill coming back? That's the question. That's the question. It's hard to imagine them beating the Patriots for the division, but you could see them competing with, teams like Baltimore or Houston or Kansas City for one of those wild card spots. And so the Dolphins will be a team to keep an eye on. If you like this video, please click subscribe because we are going to have some awesome videos. At the end of the preseason, we're going to go ahead and break down all 32 teams' rosters. And then each week before Sunday, we're going to preview the upcoming week's games. And then in the middle of the week, we're going to actually review the games from the previous week. So click subscribe because we are going to have the best content on YouTube on the NFL. Thank you so much.